This is the first time I attend this conference in Arizona. It's a magnificent conference in a very beautiful surrounding, and so I would like to thank the Spiritual Assembly and the committee involved for inviting me and Bita to attend this conference. The topic of my discussion is the spiritual foundation of peace in the writings of the Bab. On the one hand, the choice of this topic is very natural, understandable, because we are still in 2019, and 2019, of course, is the year to celebrate the unique contributions and creativity of the Bab. So to have as the title of my talk, Writings of the Bab, becomes natural. At the same time, my topic seems to be strange, because this conference, the focus of this conference is on peace. And so to talk about the spiritual foundation of peace in the writings of the Bab, it may appear a little bit strange for the simple reason that there are a number of harsh laws in the writings of the Bab. Shoghi Effendi in God Passes By has referred to philosophy of some of these harsh laws, but there are some holy war-like statements in the writings of the Bab. And so it appears, again, a paradoxical question to talk about foundation of peace in the writings of the Bab. But in general, the revelation of the Bab is the mediating point between the Islam and the Baha'i faith. And of course, the supreme purpose of the Baha'i revelation is creation of peace in the world. Because the Bab was the mediating force, preparing the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah and the culture of peace, then of course the entire writings of the Bab must be devoted to the question of peace. The foundation of peace must be present in the writings of the Bab. So we have to discuss this question and at the same time address that apparent paradox that at the beginning I mentioned. But I decided, because we have very limited time, that instead of having a very elaborate discussion, in order to address the topic, I'm going to discuss 7 things as they are discussed in the writings of the Bab. These 7 things at first might seem to be totally unrelated to each other. These 7 things that I want to talk about, one is mirror, one is farmer, one is stone, one is tea, one is sun, one is beloved, and the last one is the sword. I want to talk about 7 things, and if you paid attention to the list of these 7 items, they don't seem to be much related to the question of peace. But we are going to look at the writings of the Bab as these 7 things manifest themselves and gain a new meaning and life in his writings. Let's begin with the concept of mirror. The concept of mirror is perhaps the most central concept in the writings of the Bab. For the Bab, the entire being is defined as mirror. Everything is a mirror in the sense that everything is a reflection of divine names and attributes. So God is like the sun. The sun is being manifested in the mirror of all beings. This fundamental philosophical principle in the writings of the Bab, that he emphasizes it all the time in all his writings in very complex fashions. This is the foundation of peace. No peace is possible without this conception. One implication of this is about the concept of identity. We had just right now a performance on the concept of I and identity. For the Bab, all beings are mirrors. Humanity so far, when looking at humanity, they have looked at the characteristics of mirror as the characteristics of the glasses. My glass is different from your glass. We both are mirrors. Some glasses are red, some glasses are yellow, some glasses are circular, some glasses are large, some glasses are short. Glasses are different from each other. Humanity's concept of identity has been always and continues to be so, right now actually more than before. Identity is reduced to the characteristics of these glasses of the mirrors. In other words, our truth, our identity is defined in terms of what separates us from each other. It is my gender, it is my race, it is my nation, it is my language, it is my religion, it's my social class and other things which define my identity. If you take any course in any university which deals with the question of identity, the only concept that you learn about identity is that your identity is reduced to gender, race, nationality, language, and the like. And these are the courses that those who teach these courses actually, they have sympathy for peace. But the message of these courses, just like the past, is to reduce us to what separates us from each other. That means our truth becomes, our identity defines us as strangers or enemies. The other is either my stranger to me, or is my enemy. With such conception of identity, peace is never possible. In order to have peace, before anything, we need to have a new definition of our reality and the reality of others. And this is the message of the Bab. The Bab said that the characteristics of the glasses are not important. They are secondary issues. The truth of mirror is the image of the sun, which is reflected in this mirror. The truth of the mirror is that force, that beauty, which is reflected in it from the sun. Now, in this new conception, then, the truth of all beings, human and nature, all beings are one and the same. At the same time, all beings become sacred. All beings become beautiful. And this is the way that all humanity should see each other and should treat each other, as well as nature. That is culture of peace. The second idea that I want to talk about is concept of farmer. At the time that the Bab was writing, humanity, and particularly in the Middle East, but it continues in some ways even right now, has had a conception of social hierarchy. In this social hierarchy, the highest were the kings, because the kings in the past were also the richest people of the world. Right now, the political leaders are not necessarily the richest people of the world. But in those times, the richest people of the world were the monarchs. So the kings were the highest in social hierarchy. The lowest were the peasants, those who would work on the land, till the land, plant the seeds and the like. It is very interesting that the Bab in his book, the Book of Divine Names, Kitab al-Asma, he talks not only of kings as reflections of the names of God, because the supreme king is God, but he also talks of the farmer, cultivator, sower, as the name of God. In one very important chapter in that book, God addresses humanity and says, do you think that you are really the farmers? And then God answers that, no, I am the real farmer, Zareh. And then God explains why he is the supreme farmer, the supreme cultivator. He says, because I plant the seeds of my divine verses, of my words, in the hearts and the souls of the people. So if people would purify the soil of their hearts, then this seed would instantly yield fruits. But what is the implication of this? The Bab continues in his discussion. He says, because both the farmers and the kings, their truth is nothing but reflection of my names and attributes. Therefore, they are both the same, and therefore, you have to treat the farmers among you exactly in the same way that you treat the kings among you. Again, the previous concept that everything is mirror of God, reflecting divine attributes, now translates itself into a conception of an ethics, of a culture of how to deal with different categories of human beings, and that is the requirement of peace. The third one that I want to talk about is stone. The word that the Bab discusses that in his Persian bayan is sang. Sang. Sang means a piece of rock, a stone, a piece of pebble. Why the Bab uses this particular one? Because he explains that in the universe it seems that the most worthless thing is a piece of pebble. Has no value. It's everywhere and the most material thing, and nobody cares about it. The Bab wants to change all these things. So he creates a law. He creates a new language and a new linguistics. He says that when you are thinking of any object, any person or anything, or if you want to do anything with regard to any object or any person, you have to remember the name of that thing. And he says that you should do this in any language. So he's doing that in Persian, Arabic, but he says that in every language you should do that. And then he says, remembering the name of that thing, you have to divide the name into alphabetical letters which constitute that name. And then he says you have to take each one of these letters as abbreviation of one of the names and attributes of God. In this way, according to the Bab, everything, even the most worthless things, becomes suddenly a combination, an embodiment of various divine names and attributes. Everything becomes divine. Everything becomes sacred. And this is the way that you have to treat everything in the universe. The example, therefore, that he gives is an example of a piece of rock, a pebble, sang. And he says in the S, because in Persian, it consists of three letters, S, N, and G. He says in the S, you should see nothing but Sobuh, sanctified is God. In the N, you should see nothing but Nur, light. And in the G, because he wants to give Quranic names of God, and in Arabic there is no G, so equivalent becomes K. In that, you should see nothing but Karim, all bountiful. So a piece of worthless thing, a piece of rock, becomes embodiment of the names of God, sanctified, light, all bountiful. By the way, you can feel the love that is the whole being of the Bab. The whole being of the Bab, which is manifested in his writings, is really this absolute universal love for everything. The fourth concept that I want to talk about it briefly is tea. Now, tea is very, very important in the writings of the Bab, and we don't have time to discuss the concept of tea really. But one aspect of that I want to mention here very briefly. You know, the Bab wrote a commentary on a Quranic surah called Kawthar in honor of Wahid, of Yahya Darabi. In the beginning of that commentary that the Bab is writing, it's a huge book, this commentary of the Bab. One of the very interesting things that the Bab says, he says that if I want to explain to you, to manifest to you, to unveil for you the entire meaning of paradise and the 4 rivers of paradise through this cup of tea that I'm offering right now to you, I certainly would be able to do that. I remember the first time that I read that, and I said how a cup of tea is going to be, manifesting the entire concept of paradise and the 4 rivers of paradise. At the end of the text, the Bab almost explains that, but very briefly. But in his other writings, he explains that in a very clear fashion. Parts of that. Now, what are the 4 rivers of paradise? According to the Quran, which is partly influenced by Torah, in paradise we have 4 rivers. One is pure water, one is pure milk, one is pure honey, and the 4th one is wine. According to the Bab, the tea that he was offering to Wahid Darabi, which we understand also now by these statements, that he was in the presence of the Bab, and the Bab is offering tea to him. For the Bab, a cup of tea embodies within itself the 4 rivers of paradise. First of all, there can be no tea without water. So water becomes that river of water. Secondly, it is clear that the way the Bab would drink tea, he would use some milk as well. The Indian, British version of tea drinking. And that becomes the 2nd river. But the Bab also offers sugar, which is the honey element. And then there is no tea possible without the tea leaves. And the tea leaves have that function, that relaxing function, which partly exists in the wine. And so in this cup of tea, all those rivers of paradise come together. But aside from this beautiful imagery, what the Bab is saying is something very profound. The traditional distinction that the world has made always between a material world and a spiritual world, between this world and the next world, the Bab is destroying that distinction. The Bab is saying that the truth of everything is spiritual. We don't have to wait to die so that we experience a spiritual life. Our very existence here, everything in its truth is already spiritual. There is nothing but divine reflection and divine revelation. That is the truth of everything. So even the material form is just a form which is hiding a fundamental truth, which is the spiritual reality. Again, the point becomes that the entire reality, instead of conflicting and contradicting or opposing the spiritual truth, is the very embodiment of a spiritual truth. This again becomes an attitude of reverence, of respect, of love for everything, for everyone. I can't discuss the concept of paradise, heaven and hell in the writings of the Bab because it is so beautiful, but it needs more time. So from the point of view of the Bab, experiencing a cup of tea, if it is in the spirit of love, if it is in the spirit of spiritual orientation, is simultaneously being present in paradise, in heaven, and experiencing all rivers of paradise. The next element that I want to talk about is the sun in heaven. Already you have noted this concept in discussing of the mirror, because it's so central. But in addition to the previous meanings and concepts that we have talked about, the Bab frequently uses the concept of the sun in order to convey a new spiritual truth which was hidden from the eyes of humanity. His point is that although infinitely the sun dawns and then sets, appears from a particular eastern horizon, and then sets in a different western horizon. But he said that there is always one sun. It's the same sun, has different horizons, appears in different horizons, but it is the same sun. And this becomes a powerful principle of the unity of all manifestations of God, of all messengers of God, all prophets, all religions, all words of God. And of course, this is the most important element for creation of peace. Religion, from the point of view of the Bab, from the point of view of Baha'u'llah, is intended to be an occasion to bring people and the world closer to each other, to make us more spiritual. But religion, when it is understood in a wrong fashion, becomes the most important and most powerful force for conflict, for hatred, for justification of war and violence. Therefore, discovery of the unity of all religions, that this is the truth of all prophets of God and so on, is this absolute necessity for a culture of peace and for instituting peace in the world. Another one is the concept of beloved. Almost all religions have this millenarian expectation. The idea is that a promised one would come, a savior would come, and would make everything good. Usually when followers of a religion, they witness that their religion could not conquer the world, the solution for that was a sort of psychological projection that a savior would come and that savior would make our religion the dominant religion of the world. And that conception, that millenarian conception, is almost always completely a violent concept. That savior comes and makes my religion the dominant religion of the world. Subdue all religions, all people, anybody who has a different idea and so on, by coercion. Either they would die or they become submissive to this new religion. And this is usually understood by them as concept of justice, like the concept of Shia Islam and their 12 Imam. The Bab in his writings also has a millenarian conception. Everything that he discusses in Persian Bayan or his other writings, later writings, is about a promised one, is about the person that he calls this person, he whom God shall make manifest, or Baha'u'llah. But there is a new twist in this story. The Bab always emphasizes that he whom God shall make manifest is our beloved. But because he is beloved, anybody who attributes himself to the beloved also should be loved. That means a new thing. In the past, the obsession with this millenarian culture was also the obsession of hatred against the imposters. If a person claimed to be, for instance, the 12 Imam, but he is not really the 12 Imam, then it is the duty of a good Shia Muslim to try to kill this person and anybody who believes in this person. Censorship, violence, discrimination, and murder becomes the natural order of response to this situation. The Bab completely changes this. He says that even if somebody makes a claim to be he whom God shall make manifest, and even if this person is not really he whom God shall make manifest, but because this person is attributing himself to the beloved, therefore the believers of the Bab should also have love for this person. Not only they should not do anything to cause harm or sadness to this person, but also they have to make sure that this person would have a good life. Even the Bab makes a law that the state should create a pension for this person so that throughout the life of this person, he would never or she would never experience any sadness. You already can see that the culture of violence is eliminated. And that's the very being of the Bab. The being of the Bab is being reflected in his words and teachings. And that's why the Baha'i faith is part of these twin revelations. That's why the Bab and Baha'u'llah are inseparable from each other. The fact that some of the Baha'is assume that they can be completely ignorant about the Bab, the writings of the Bab, the message of the Bab, and yet to be able to understand the writings of Baha'u'llah in a very adequate fashion and so on. That's a grave mistake, sometimes common mistake. My final comment is about the seventh category, which is the concept of the sword. Here I am directly going to address those harsh laws of the Bab. There are a number of laws in the Persian Bayan which are, in a sense, jihad-like laws, namely holy war-oriented laws. And in these laws, the non-Babis are treated in a very harsh manner. They really can't have the right to own anything. They cannot live in particular areas of Iran, and a number of things like that. The Babi cannot marry a non-Babi. There are a number of harsh laws like these. I mean, what I said are the most of them. But it is very interesting that the Bab, as the person who is paving the way for the emergence of the culture of peace by Baha'u'llah, he is simultaneously using the categories, Islamic categories, which were supposed to be the characteristics of the functions of these Islamic promised one. The Bab was supposed to be this promised one of Islam, and he was supposed to come with the sword and kill all the non-believers and establish justice in that way. So these concepts have some presence in the writings of the Bab, and yet he wants to prepare people for the culture of peace of Baha'u'llah. So what the Bab says, what is his strategy? His strategy is to make these laws impossible to be achieved, impossible to be realized. First of all, he emphasizes many, many times in Persian Bayan that these laws can be practiced only by the Babi king, not by any ordinary Babi. So before the emergence of the Babi kings, namely before the Babi religion becomes dominant religion, or in the words of the Bab, becomes exalted, none of these laws can be practiced. Secondly, he says that the condition of practicing these laws is that nobody becomes sad. Imagine that you want to confiscate the property of non-believers, and imagine that nobody would become sad. So you can engage in these harsh laws, but provided that nobody would become sad. But the most important is none of the two that I mentioned already. The two already have made it impossible to be realized because the Bab knew that the promised one is coming in a few years, and there would never be any Babi king. But the most important is the third condition. In the chapter that he's discussing this question, he says that the question of marrying non-Babis, namely the prohibition of marrying non-Babis and prohibition of property for the non-Babis, he says that you should practice this only after the Babi religion has been exalted, has become dominant. But he says before that time, you should never practice any of these things so that people become attracted to the Babi religion. In order for people to become attracted to the Babi religion, then the Babis should marry non-Babis. There should be absolutely no discrimination whatsoever in a society defined by writings of the Bab. But then he says, but that moment in which the practice of these harsh laws begins, the moment of exaltation of the Babi religion, he says it is the beginning of the revelation of he whom God shall make manifest. In other words, the Bab gives a number of harsh laws, but he says that these harsh laws can never be practiced before the manifestation of the next religion. After the next religion comes, after he whom God shall make manifest appears, then you should start to apply these harsh laws. And of course, that means, according to the Bab himself, that this is impossible, because the Bab constantly says that when the promised one would come, all the laws of the Bab are abrogated. Everything that he, Baha'u'llah, would decide, that would be the law. And of course, we know that, as a matter of fact, the first very experience of revelation of Baha'u'llah was that verily we shall render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen, namely no sword anymore, non-violence. So you can see that the Bab has gone out of his way, on the one hand, to perform this mediating transitional function that he was supposed to do between Islam, making people from that culture of holy war and discrimination and violence, make that culture ready to embrace a new culture of universal peace. But at the same time, he has redefined the category of the sword, my last concept, sword, in a way that this sword can never be used. So, through these 7 things that I mentioned, you can have a glimpse of the very fact that the spiritual foundation of peace is in the writings of the Bab. And most importantly, this foundation is spiritual. It is a spiritual foundation. We Baha'is always say the spiritual solution to this question, to that question. But we normally forget what is spiritual. Spiritual is what the Bab emphasized so much in his writings. That's the concept of mirror. That's the concept of stone. That's the concept of tea. Namely, all beings, their truth is that they are reflections of God. All beings are sacred. All beings are beautiful. All beings are one. And that becomes concept of peace.